In the high valleys of eastern Tennessee, November 1953. While most folks were boarding up their windows and praying for mercy, a woman named Ruth Calloway was doing something that made her neighbors question her sanity. She was walking toward the storm, not away from it. Carrying nothing but a kerosene lantern and a coil of rope, she moved through sheets of rain that fell sideways, driven by winds that would later be measured at over 90 miles per hour. The object of her journey was not her own homestead, which sat protected in a hollow 2 miles back. She was headed for the ridge where 83-year-old Mabel Hensley lived alone in a house that had stood for 67 years, but would not stand through this night. The people of Copper Creek had been telling Mabel for years that she needed to move down into the valley. That old cabin of hers was too exposed, they said, too far from help, too dangerous for a woman her age. But Mabel had buried her husband up on that ridge, and she intended to be buried beside him, and she did not care one bit what anyone thought about her stubbornness. Now, as the storm of the century bore down on the Appalachians, that stubbornness was about to cost her everything she had. Ruth Calloway barely made it in time. She found Mabel huddled in her root cellar, listening to the sounds of her world being torn apart above her. The roof went first, peeling away like the lid of a tin can. Then the walls buckled. By morning, there was nothing left of Mabel Hensley's home but a pile of broken timber and scattered memories, and an old woman with nowhere to go. What happened next would become the most talked about story in Copper Creek for the next half-century. And if you think you know where this is going, I promise you, you do not. If you are not subscribed to this channel, now is the time, because this story of survival, stubbornness, and one woman's impossible solution to an impossible problem is unlike anything you have heard before. Drop a comment and let me know where you are watching from. Now, let me tell you about Ruth Calloway and what she decided to build. Ruth was 47 years old that November, a widow herself, childless by choice, and possessed of a reputation that the valley could not quite pin down. She was not unfriendly, but she was not social either. She did not attend church, though she was not irreligious. She did not gossip, though she listened carefully to everything that was said around her. She had come to Copper Creek in 1938 with her husband, Thomas, a geologist who spent his days mapping the caves and mineral deposits that honeycombed the mountains around them. Thomas had died of pneumonia in the winter of 1946, and Ruth had simply continued on, living in the small but sturdy stone house he had built, maintaining herself with a combination of subsistence farming, herb gathering, and the occasional sale of handmade furniture to tourists passing through on their way to the Smokies. What most people did not know about Ruth was that she had grown up in a family of coal miners in eastern Kentucky, people who understood darkness and stone the way farmers understood soil and seasons. Her father had worked 30 years underground before his lungs gave out, and her mother had raised 7 children on wages that would have broken a weaker woman. Ruth had learned early that survival meant using whatever the earth provided, and that the earth, despite its hardness, provided more than most people knew. When she married Thomas Calloway, she found someone who shared her fascination with what lay beneath the surface. She spent nearly every day of her marriage following him into the darkness beneath the mountains. She knew those caves better than anyone alive. She knew which ones flooded in spring and which stayed dry year-round. She knew where the air flowed and where it stagnated. She knew where the limestone had been carved by ancient rivers into chambers large enough to hold a church service, and where it narrowed into passages that would crush a man who tried to squeeze through. This knowledge, acquired over 8 years of exploration and catalogued in the leather journals Thomas had left behind, was about to become the foundation of something no one in Copper Creek had ever imagined. The morning after the storm, Ruth brought Mabel down to her own house. The old woman was in shock, saying little, eating less. She had lost everything: her furniture, her clothes, her photographs, the quilt her mother had made for her wedding, the rocking chair her husband had carved during the long winter of 1912. All of it was gone, scattered across the mountainside or smashed beyond recognition. For 3 days, Mabel barely moved from the chair by Ruth's fireplace. She refused to discuss the future. When neighbors came to offer condolences and suggest that perhaps it was time for Mabel to move to the county home in Madisonville, she simply closed her eyes and turned her face away. The neighbors meant well, mostly. They brought casseroles and quilts and words of comfort that Mabel did not seem to hear. Some offered spare rooms in their own homes, temporary arrangements until something more permanent could be figured out. But Mabel had lived alone for 23 years since her husband passed, and the thought of becoming a burden, of sleeping in someone else's house and eating someone else's food and following someone else's routines, was worse to her than dying. She had always said she would rather be dead than dependent, and now that the moment had come, she found she still believed it. Ruth watched all of this without saying much. She brought Mabel meals that went mostly uneaten. She kept the fire burning and the house warm. She sat with the old woman in companionable silence, asking no questions and making no suggestions. But behind her calm exterior, Ruth's mind was working. She remembered something Thomas had told her years ago, something about a cave that caught the winter sun. It was on the 4th day that Ruth made her announcement. She had spent those 3 days not just caring for Mabel, but hiking the ridges above Copper Creek, checking the caves she knew, measuring, calculating, and making plans. Now she stood in front of Mabel's chair and said the words that would set the valley talking for years to come. She was going to build Mabel a home inside a cave. The reaction was immediate and nearly unanimous. Everyone thought Ruth Calloway had lost her mind. A cave was no place for a human being to live, certainly not an 83-year-old woman with arthritis and a heart condition. Caves were dark, damp, cold, and dangerous. They were full of bats and snakes, and the kind of air that could suffocate a person without warning. Building a home in a cave was not just foolish, it was cruel. A death sentence dressed up as charity. Harold Whitmore, who ran the general store and considered himself the voice of practical wisdom in Copper Creek, put it plainly to anyone who would listen. He called it the most harebrained idea he had heard in 40 years of listening to harebrained ideas. He said Ruth might as well dig a grave and push Mabel into it. At least that way the old woman would not suffer through a slow death by darkness and damp. Martha Gaines, who taught Sunday school and organized the annual church picnic, said she would pray for Ruth, which in Copper Creek was not always a compliment. Emmett Hughes, who had farmed the valley his whole life and knew more about practical matters than anyone, shook his head slowly when he heard the news and said that Ruth had always been a little odd, but this time she had gone completely around the bend. Even Mabel's own nephew, who had driven up from Knoxville to assess the situation and had hoped to convince his aunt to come live with his family, declared that Ruth Calloway should be stopped before she did something they would all regret. The opposition was fierce, but it was also distant. People talked and worried and prophesied disaster, but no one actually tried to interfere. This was partly because Ruth Calloway had a way of discouraging interference, a quiet firmness in her manner that suggested arguments would be wasted. And it was partly because Mabel herself, when asked directly, said she wanted Ruth to try. Her exact words, spoken to Harold Whitmore when he came to the house to register his objections in person, were that she would rather die trying something crazy than live doing something sensible. Harold had no response to that, but Ruth had done her calculations. The cave she had in mind was not some random hole in the mountainside. It was a specific chamber in a system Thomas had mapped extensively in 1941. It sat 40 feet below the ridge crest, protected from weather by the mountain itself. The chamber was roughly 30 feet wide and 20 feet deep, with a ceiling that rose to 12 feet at its highest point. Most importantly, it faced south-southeast, which meant that during the winter months, sunlight would penetrate deep into the entrance for several hours each day. The chamber was naturally ventilated through a series of small passages that connected to the surface above, creating a gentle but constant flow of fresh air, and the temperature inside held steady at 56 degrees year-round, warmer than the outside air in winter and cooler in summer. Ruth knew all of this because Thomas had written it down. He had been fascinated by this particular cave, which he called the sundial chamber, because of the way light moved across its walls at different times of year. He had even sketched out, half-jokingly, how a person might live there quite comfortably if they had reason to. Ruth had always thought it was just one of his fancies. Now she understood he had given her a gift she had never expected to use. The work began in mid-November, just 2 weeks after the storm. Ruth started by clearing the entrance, which had become partially blocked by debris over the years since Thomas's last visit. She hauled out rocks by hand, working alone because no one in Copper Creek would help her with what they considered a fool's errand. The entrance passage was narrow, barely 4 feet wide, and Ruth spent the first 3 days simply making it passable for someone of Mabel's frail constitution. Inside the main chamber, she began the real work. The floor was uneven, covered with a layer of fine silt deposited over millennia by water that no longer flowed there. Ruth leveled a section near the back wall, packing down the earth and covering it with flat stones she carried in from a creek bed half a mile away. This would be the foundation for Mabel's living space. The skeptics of Copper Creek watched from a distance, shaking their heads. Some came closer, curious despite themselves, and what they saw only confirmed their doubts. Ruth Calloway, covered in mud and limestone dust, hauling stones into a hole in the ground like some kind of primitive creature building a den. It was pitiful, they said. It was embarrassing. Someone should stop her before she hurt herself, or, worse, hurt poor Mabel. But Ruth kept working. She built a wooden platform over the stone foundation, using lumber salvaged from the ruins of Mabel's old house. There was a kind of rightness to this, she thought, using the bones of the old home to build the new one. The platform raised the living area 6 inches off the cave floor, creating an air gap that would prevent moisture from seeping up from below. Over the platform, she laid a floor of polished oak planks, sanded smooth and fitted together so tightly that a coin could not slip between them. The walls came next. Ruth knew that bare limestone, while beautiful, would feel cold and institutional. Mabel needed warmth, needed to feel that she was in a home and not a tomb. So Ruth lined the walls with wood paneling, leaving small gaps at the top and bottom to allow the natural ventilation to continue. She used cedar, which she knew would resist rot and fill the space with a pleasant scent that would mask any mustiness. The paneling stopped 8 feet up, leaving the upper walls and ceiling as natural stone, but painted white with a lime wash that brightened the space dramatically. By the end of November, the basic structure was complete. A one-room living space, roughly 15 feet square, with a raised platform floor, cedar-paneled walls, and a ceiling that soared upward into the pale limestone above. But Ruth was not finished. A room was not a home. A home needed light. This was where Ruth's solution became truly ingenious. The cave's entrance faced south-southeast, which meant direct sunlight only reached the interior during the morning hours. In the afternoon and evening, the chamber would fall into shadow. Ruth needed a way to bring light deeper into the space, and she found her answer in something Thomas had written about in his journals: heliostat mirrors. A heliostat is simply a mirror mounted on a mechanism that tracks the sun, reflecting light into a fixed location. Thomas had sketched a simple version in his notes, meant for illuminating cave passages during extended explorations. Ruth built her own version on a larger scale. She mounted 3 mirrors outside the cave entrance, positioned to catch sunlight throughout the day and redirected through the entrance passage. The mirrors were adjusted manually, using a simple clockwork mechanism she adapted from an old mantel clock. Every few hours, the mirrors would need to be repositioned slightly, but the task was easy enough that even Mabel could manage it. The effect was remarkable. Sunlight poured into the chamber, reflected and concentrated by the mirrors, filling the space with a warm, golden glow that made it feel less like a cave and more like a cottage with unusually thick walls. The light moved across the floor and walls throughout the day, just as it would through windows in a conventional house. Ruth hung white muslin curtains at the entrance, which diffused the light and created a soft, dreamlike quality that visitors would later describe as magical. But light was only part of the equation. A home needed heat. Here, Ruth took advantage of something most people considered a liability: the cave's constant 56-degree temperature. In winter, when outside temperatures often dropped below freezing, the cave started out 16 or 20 degrees warmer than the ambient air. Ruth only needed to make up the difference. She built a small wood stove from an old cast-iron washpot, fitting it with a chimney that vented through one of the natural passages in the cave's ceiling. The stove was tiny by conventional standards, meant only to supplement the cave's natural warmth, not to fight against bitter cold. A few sticks of firewood in the morning and a few more in the evening were enough to keep the interior comfortable. In summer, the stove sat cold, and the cave's natural coolness provided relief from the sweltering heat outside. December came, and with it the first real test of Ruth's creation. A cold snap settled over the mountains, dropping temperatures to single digits and coating everything with a thick layer of ice. The people of Copper Creek huddled around their fires, burning through their wood supplies at alarming rates. And up on the ridge, in her cave home, Mabel Hensley sat in her rocking chair, which Ruth had somehow managed to find intact among the storm debris, wearing a light sweater and reading by reflected sunlight, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Word spread slowly at first, then faster. Ruth Calloway's crazy cave house actually worked. Not just worked, but worked better than most of the conventional homes in the valley. Visitors began to appear, first the curious, then the genuinely interested. They found something that defied their expectations at every turn. The interior was warm and dry, with none of the dampness they had expected. The air was fresh, carrying a faint scent of cedar and wood smoke. The light was surprisingly good, bright enough to read by during daylight hours, and supplemented in the evenings by kerosene lamps whose flames seemed to dance with unusual vigor in the oxygen-rich cave air. And there was Mabel herself, transformed from the broken woman who had huddled by Ruth's fireplace into someone who seemed, improbably, younger and more vital than she had been before the storm. Part of this transformation was physical. The cave's constant temperature meant Mabel no longer suffered the joint pain that cold weather had always aggravated. The humidity was low, but not dry, easier on her lungs than either the winter cold or the summer heat of a conventional home. And the simple act of walking the entrance passage several times a day, of tending the small stove and adjusting the mirrors, gave her exercise she had not realized she needed. But the transformation was also psychological. Mabel had expected to spend her final years in diminishment, watching her world shrink around her until nothing was left. Instead, she found herself in a place of wonder, a home unlike any she had ever known, with visitors coming to see what she and Ruth had created. She was not a burden to be managed, but a pioneer to be admired. The children of Copper Creek came to hear her stories and stare at the cave walls and ask questions that made her feel like the most interesting person in the world. Martha Gaines, the Sunday school teacher who had promised to pray for Ruth, came to visit in February and left with tears in her eyes. She told everyone she met that she had been wrong, that Ruth Calloway had not lost her mind, but had perhaps found something the rest of them had lost long ago. Emmett Hughes came too, bringing his wife, and spent an hour examining the construction with the eye of a man who knew how to build things that lasted. He pronounced it sound, more than sound, and asked Ruth if she would show him Thomas's journals. Harold Whitmore was one of the last to visit, coming in late January out of what he claimed was concern, but was probably closer to wounded pride. He walked through the entrance passage with his shoulders hunched, expecting to hate everything he saw. Instead, he stood in the middle of the chamber for a long time without speaking. When he finally found words, he admitted that Ruth had done something remarkable. He said he had been wrong. He said it twice, as if he could not quite believe the words were coming out of his mouth. But Ruth was not finished yet. A home needed more than shelter. A home needed life. Spring came early that year, and with it, Ruth began the most ambitious phase of her project. The entrance to the cave opened onto a small, natural terrace, perhaps 20 feet wide and 30 feet deep, carved into the mountainside by some ancient geological process. This terrace caught full sun for most of the day and was protected from wind by the mountain rising behind it. Ruth looked at the space and saw something no one else had imagined. A garden. The soil on the terrace was thin and rocky, barely suitable for anything. Ruth spent weeks improving it, hauling in topsoil from the valley below, one bucket at a time. She made the trip dozens of times, climbing the steep path with buckets balanced on a carrying pole across her shoulders, a technique she had learned from her mother. The work would have exhausted a younger woman, but Ruth approached it with a methodical patience that turned impossible into merely difficult. She built raised beds from salvaged lumber, filling them with a mixture of soil, compost, and crucite rock dust that Thomas had noted in his journals as an excellent fertilizer. The rock dust was rich in trace minerals, and Thomas had theorized that it might explain why certain plants grew so vigorously near the cave entrances where erosion deposited the material naturally. Ruth collected it from a specific outcropping half a mile away, grinding it finer with a hand mortar before mixing it into her soil. By April, she had created 6 garden beds, each 4 feet wide and 8 feet long, ready for planting. Mabel, who had spent decades gardening on the ridge above, knew exactly what to do with them. She planted lettuce and spinach in the early spring, followed by tomatoes, peppers, and beans as the weather warmed. She planted herbs along the edges, rosemary and thyme and sage and mint, filling the terrace with scents that mingled with the fresh mountain air. She planted flowers, too, not for any practical purpose, but because a home without flowers was not really a home at all. The garden flourished. The terrace's southern exposure and the thermal mass of the cave behind it created a microclimate several degrees warmer than the surrounding area. Plants that struggled elsewhere thrived here. The growing season extended later into fall and started earlier in spring. Mabel, who had thought her gardening days were over, found herself producing more food than she could eat. And then there were the chickens. Ruth had always kept chickens, tough mountain birds that scratched out a living on whatever they could find. She brought 6 hens up to the cave in late spring, housing them in a small coop she built on the western edge of the terrace. The chickens took to their new home immediately, perhaps sensing, as animals sometimes do, that this was a safe and abundant place. They produced eggs reliably, more reliably than they had at Ruth's own homestead, and Mabel delighted in caring for them. The hens became more than livestock to Mabel. They became companions. She named each one, learning their individual personalities, their preferences, their small dramas and rivalries. She talked to them as she scattered their feed each morning, asking after their health and commenting on the weather. Some people might have found this sad, an old woman with no one to talk to but chickens. But Mabel had always preferred the company of creatures that did not judge or gossip or offer unwanted advice. The chickens asked nothing of her but food and water and a safe place to sleep. And in return, they gave her eggs and entertainment and the simple pleasure of caring for living things. By summer, the transformation was complete. What had begun as a desperate solution to an impossible problem had become something that looked remarkably like paradise. Mabel's cave home was warm in winter and cool in summer. It was bright with reflected sunlight and alive with growing things. It had fresh eggs in the morning and fresh vegetables for dinner. It had a rocking chair by the entrance where an old woman could sit and watch the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. It had everything Mabel had lost in the storm, and in some ways, more. The community's attitude shifted dramatically. The same people who had called Ruth crazy now called her a genius. They came to study what she had built, to understand how it worked, to ask if she might help them create similar spaces for their own families. Ruth, true to her nature, refused payment for her advice, but gave it freely to anyone who asked. Over the following years, 2 more cave homes were established in the area, both modeled on Ruth's design, both housing elderly residents who might otherwise have been sent away to institutional care. The first was for Jacob Miller, a widower of 79, whose arthritis had made it impossible for him to keep up with the maintenance his old farmhouse required. His son had been ready to sell the family land and move Jacob to a nursing home in Chattanooga when Ruth suggested an alternative. There was a smaller cave on the Miller property, not as ideal as the sundial chamber, but workable. Ruth spent 3 months helping Jacob's son convert it, teaching him the techniques she had developed. Jacob lived there for 7 years, tending a small garden and keeping bees, until pneumonia took him peacefully in his sleep. The second was more ambitious. The Hendricks family had 4 elderly relatives scattered across 3 counties, all of them struggling to maintain independence in homes too large and too cold for their aging bodies. Ruth proposed something radical: a small community of cave dwellings, linked by a shared terrace and communal garden. The project took 2 years to complete, but when it was finished, it housed all 4 relatives within easy visiting distance of each other, with younger family members taking turns checking in and helping with tasks that required more strength or mobility. But the cave home was more than just a practical solution. It became a symbol of something larger, something the people of Copper Creek had perhaps forgotten. It showed that the old ways were not always wrong, that sometimes the land itself could provide shelter if you knew how to listen to it. It showed that caring for the elderly did not have to mean sending them away, that community and ingenuity could create alternatives that preserved dignity and independence. And it showed that one stubborn woman, working alone against the doubts of everyone around her, could change the way people thought about what was possible. Mabel Hensley lived in her cave home for 11 more years. She died there in March of 1965, peacefully, in the rocking chair by the entrance, with spring sunlight streaming in through the muslin curtains and the first crocuses blooming in her garden beds. She was 94 years old. The people who had once pitied her, who had assumed she would die miserable and alone in a damp hole in the ground, came to her memorial service and spoke of how the last years of her life had been her happiest. Ruth Calloway outlived her by 15 years, passing away in 1980 at the age of 74. She never moved into the cave herself, though she visited almost daily until her health prevented it. After Mabel's death, she maintained the space as a kind of memorial, keeping the garden tended and the mirrors adjusted, welcoming visitors who came from increasingly far away to see the impossible thing she had built. The cave home still exists today, though it has changed hands several times and been modified by subsequent owners. The basic structure Ruth created remains intact, a testament to the quality of her work and the soundness of her design. The garden has expanded over the years, terraced down the mountainside in a cascade of growing beds. The chicken coop has been rebuilt twice, but still houses birds descended from Ruth's original flock. But what endures most powerfully is not the physical structure. It is the idea behind it. In an age when we increasingly warehouse our elderly in institutions, when we treat old age as a problem to be managed rather than a stage of life to be honored, Ruth Calloway's creation stands as a reminder that there are other ways. But with ingenuity and determination, and a willingness to challenge conventional thinking, we can create spaces where the old can live with dignity, where they can remain connected to the land and the seasons and the simple pleasures of life. Ruth never sought recognition for what she did. She never wrote about it, or gave interviews, or tried to turn her creation into a business. She simply saw a problem and solved it, using the knowledge her husband had left her and the stubbornness she had been born with. When people praised her, she deflected, saying she had only done what anyone would have done. But that was not true. Anyone might have wanted to help Mabel Hensley. Only Ruth Calloway had the knowledge, the determination, and the vision to help her in a way that no one else could have imagined. In the end, what Ruth built was not just a home. It was a statement about what we owe to each other, about the possibilities that open up when we refuse to accept the limitations that others try to impose on us. It was proof that the unconventional solution is sometimes the right one, that the person the community dismisses as crazy may be the only one seeing clearly. And it was a gift, not just to Mabel Hensley, but to everyone who has ever faced an impossible situation and wondered whether there might be another way. The mountains of eastern Tennessee are full of caves. Most of them will never be anything but dark spaces underground, homes to bats and salamanders and the slow drip of water through stone. But one of them, for 11 years, was something more. It was proof that shelter can be found in unexpected places, that warmth can exist even in the depths of the earth, that a garden can bloom where no garden should be possible. And it was the creation of a woman who looked at an 83-year-old widow with nowhere to go and refused to accept that there was no answer. What would you do if you faced a situation that everyone told you was impossible? Would you accept the conventional wisdom, or would you look for the path that no one else could see? Drop your answer in the comments below. And if this story moved you, if it made you think differently about what is possible, consider subscribing to this channel. We tell stories like this one every week. Stories of ordinary people who did extraordinary things, who refused to give up when everyone else had already surrendered. Hit the subscribe button and the notification bell, and I will see you in the next video. Because there are caves all around us, metaphorical ones if not literal, waiting to be transformed into something no one ever imagined. All they need is someone stubborn enough to try.